don't know, are we supposed to start right away? Or I think? Sure. Well, good afternoon. Welcome back for those of you who have been to some of the morning presentations. And for those of you who are just showing up for the first time, welcome. We are in the setting of the city of Alexandria, Egypt, and we are going to conduct a debate between two very important historical figures on the basic question of free expression and censorship, control of free speech, and so forth. Our topic for the afternoon will be: to what degree can a just and free society practice or allow censorship? And I will have each person speak in turn on this basic question, and perhaps take a brief moment to identify their characters for those of you who may not have been here this morning. And first of all, we have Pat Lippert, a philosophy instructor here at NIC, who is portraying Simeon ben Ezra, a sort of nom de plume for a unknown historical writer in the ancient Jewish tradition who gave a marvelous presentation this morning. And George Critchlow, who is a professor at the Gonzaga Law School for nearly 20 years and director of the Law Clinic, which is a legal services department within the law school. And as I say, he will be representing William O. Douglas. And both people have, I think, interesting perspectives on this question. Once again, to what degree can a just and free society practice or allow censorship? So please, Rabbi Ben Ezra.
Thank you. I should once again introduce myself just a bit. I am a Jewish sage, a writer of the Book of Wisdom from Alexandria in 40 BC. And I live in a predominantly Greek or secular culture, and yet I come from a predominantly sacred background. And so on that basis, that fuels my thought and gives me my character. What I say in response to censorship and a just society has to do with how we understand the business of human rights. And my only experience of human rights in my time has come from the Stoic philosophers, who said that we all have natural human rights based on a common reason and a common natural law we are meant to obey. From my background, though, and in my city, we also have experienced, basically, that we have human rights that are equal between all the members or all the citizens of Alexandria. We do not have these equal rights because we've decided they're right, or we do not have these equal rights because we've decided to write up our rights and have a document we all must adhere to. Rather, we have equal rights functioning because basically we have by chance, we have a balance of power between the different groups in our society, such that no one group can move against another without destroying the city. And on that basis, kind of by fortuitous chance, we all of us enjoy a certain freedom from censorship, a certain cosmopolitan atmosphere. On that basis, then, I've had some experience of human rights in a very early time in our history. And I would say, in response to the people around me, the Greeks in my city, is that we have a common basis for human rights. What I outlined this morning was that this common basis is finally something I called wisdom. But before we have something I called wisdom, we have a common basis in reason. And it seems very clear that both the Greeks and the Jewish people in my community can recognize the experience and the presence of reason in all human beings. On that basis, I can only say that from my point of view and in my time at 40 BC, I am interested in this notion, and I wish to pursue it. And I've had some rough experience of it. But on this point, I think we'll just let that be my departure point for understanding human rights. My only objection is that the human rights outlined by reason are, to my experience and in my experience, not enough. And so we'll be talking about sufficiency or insufficiency of criteria for human rights as our discussion unfolds.
Thank you. The Honorable Justice Douglas, would you please respond? And the same vein.
Yes. First, let me expand a little bit on who I am. I am a justice of the United States Supreme Court. I'm now dead, actually. I died in, I believe, 1980. But I was on the court from 1939 to about 1976. I was born in Yakima. I spent a lot of my vacation time in Goose Prairie in the Cascade Mountains in Washington. I went to college at Whitman College in Walla Walla. I went to law school in Columbia. I taught at Yale University Law School, and I was appointed by President Roosevelt to the Securities and Exchange Commission before taking my position in the United States Supreme Court. I'm known as a liberal and a strong supporter of free expression and freedom of assembly, freedom of conscience. I have spent a good part of my career on the court developing the ideas that support those freedoms in the context of the First Amendment. Since I live some 2,000 years later than the Jewish sage here, I have learned some things about what's essential and necessary to a free and just society, things that may not have been known or as clearly articulated 2,000 years ago as we're able to do so today. But the values of free speech, free expression, freedom of association, freedom of conscience, really do come out of the Jewish tradition of which the sage refers. The wisdom which is, I guess, articulated or finds expression through reason is certainly something that is instructive to modern legal theory and modern legal doctrine, including that doctrine upon which the First Amendment is based. The problem, of course, in modern times is that we are distrustful of ideas or philosophies which tend to dominate, because to my way of thinking, the only way a society can guarantee freedom to people is by ensuring that there's a condition of free expression in order to provide for pluralism, to provide for democracy. Why is that important? Because it is important for people to have the opportunity to fully develop, to fully enrich themselves, and to pursue their own version or their own sense of happiness in their lives. And to the extent that there's a dominant group or organization or authority or church that is contrary to that way of thinking, we're concerned that people's efforts to develop themselves and be who they want to be and say what they want to say can be suppressed. And that goes against the grain of constitutional democracy, civil liberties, and pluralism, which we think is the foundation of our constitutional system in modern America. So my only sense in listening to the Jewish sage is that while I agree that tolerance of diverse opinions is important, I'm suspicious sometimes that religion can be cloaked in the disguise of what is called wisdom. And I guess I would ask the Jewish sage to talk about this a little bit. When you talk about wisdom, are you really saying that I should accept your God? And I might be, as you were talking about this morning, an Epicurean, an Aristotelian, a Stoic. I might be an idol worshiper. My view is I have the right to seek my own truth, even if I happen to be an idol worshiper. My concern is, to the extent that the philosophy that you talked about this morning becomes dominant, either in Alexandria or anywhere else, are you still going to continue tolerating my right to seek truth in a contrary or in a different way?
That would be my main problem. First, though, let me break it into two parts. The first thing is that I am not engaged in what you will call later proselytizing. I am not engaged in creating converts by force. That is not the essence of my book or my thought. That will be a problem for religions in the future. That will be a problem for future religions. But that is not what I'm engaged in. We were not seeking to make everybody in Alexandria Jewish. It is, people were not willing to do that. We were simply interested in finding a common ground or a common foundation between the Jewish people and those who saw life differently. That's the reason that I experienced the business of wisdom being that common foundation. What would happen if I achieved some kind of cultural dominance? That would be the major test. And to answer that question, which I think is the second and more important portion of the question, I would like to create a kind of understanding of my own law as a Jewish person. I would like to create a special understanding here of the Ten Commandments, and let that be the way of approaching the business of cultural dominance and rights of people who do not agree with me and people who are in the minority. Should we ever become the Jewish majority, that would be the temptation we would face. Simply put, we've always viewed our Ten Commandments as two tablets of the law. You've seen, I think, in your own entertainment where the figure, the actor who plays Moses, comes down from the mountain and he's got two tablets of the law. That tradition goes back all the way to the beginning, all the way through my people. Basically, the first 5 commandments are called the first tablet of the law, and the second 5 commandments are called the second tablet. And these first 5 commandments are the famous positive commandments. They command you to do something good. They require it of you. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind. Have no other gods before him. Honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. Honor your father and mother, etc., etc. These are positive commands requiring you to do certain things, which are, by definition, good. But the second tablet is not like that. The second tablet is a series of negative commands commanding you to refrain from doing something bad. Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not lie or bear false witness. Thou shalt not covet. These are commandments not to do certain kinds of acts which are recognized as bad. I find that amongst the Greeks and all people in my society, all of us are capable of recognizing the second tablet. And it is on the basis of the second tablet then, and this experience of wisdom, that I would erect a state and I would seek to maintain relations and maintain the rights of people who do not agree with me. The problem will be, and the temptation will be, is that if I am offended by other people who do not share the observance of one of my commandments in the first tablet of the law, who do not seem to pay attention to the Lord their God, who do not seem to honor the Sabbath, I will be tempted to act against them at the expense of the second tablet of my law. So, because you don't honor the Sabbath the way I want you to in Alexandria and I were in charge, I could put you in prison or kill you. But then what have I done but transgressed against my own commandment, thou shalt not murder? So the key to understanding how we're to relate, at least as I understand it as a Jew, is to push for or represent or witness to the first tablet of the law with all my being, but without trespassing against the second tablet of my law as well. It's a difficult business of balance between the first and second tablet, between positive commands and negative commands. But that is where I would find human rights, and that is where I would find the kind of culture and society I'm seeking.
Your analysis stems obviously from your religion and the commandments in particular. But let me take you forward in history. Let's anticipate that the Messiah comes some 40 or 50 years down the road here, as predicted by the Jewish prophets of old, and an organization around that society creates a new church. And that church then is very much in the minority and is persecuted and repressed by Rome, the Roman Empire. And then later, the church gains ascendancy. It constitutes, at least in the Western world, a majority of people, but it breaks into two after a Reformation. And the Catholic side of the Reformation persecutes the Protestant side, and the Protestant side persecutes the Catholic side. And also, the Christians tend to persecute the non-Christians. We had a period called the Crusades when that happened. And there was the Inquisition when there was evidence of that. And later in modern times, we have the capitalists who persecute the socialists, and the socialists who persecute the capitalists. We have people who believe this or don't believe that persecuting one another. Now, there's not always the balance of power that may exist in Alexandria to ensure that people's rights are respected and honored simply because the power is in the balance. Sometimes it's necessary, and this is the constitutional system and the First Amendment values that I support and that I work towards in my position as a jurist, Sometimes it's necessary to have a legal framework that respects the rights of those minorities. And the question, I suppose, is what is the content of those legal values which are necessary to enforce and to protect the rights of those minorities? And I would say that that is not necessarily and cannot be necessarily a function of a particular religious doctrine or tradition, that it has to be a reasoned secular application of our power of reasoning and analysis in order to ensure that there is not some dominant strain, whether it's called wisdom in the guise of religion or whether it's called something else, which then can be used to effectively deprive people of their right to speak.
I would hope that my notion of wisdom is universal. I would hope that my notion of wisdom is available to all people. And in regards to your previous comment, you were asking, am I trying to get people to worship my God? I have to answer in a qualified sense, yes, because I simply, as a devout monotheist, don't think there are any other gods to really worship. If a person is brought into an experience of God, they will meet the God that I have met. And yet in that sense, that doesn't mean that your experience of God is going to be the same as mine. And the nature of your experience of God is going to be in large measure up to God and you, and it's going to be up especially to your understanding of wisdom. And so that is the kind of universality I am seeking and universality I've experienced. I've seen the glimmer of wisdom in people who do not believe in God. And I have to honor that. And perhaps on that basis, we can do something about erecting a framework for this kind of protection of all people in their individual searches. I think the framework can be secular to a certain degree. I think it can be secular and should be secular in the sense that we all can agree on it to begin with, if you will allow the influence of religion to participate in that sense in the public square. It cannot be immediate. I cannot seek to culturally dominate this framework that you desire. But at the same time, I cannot be excluded from some kind of influence in the public square in that sense. How would a religion basically influence the public square? Basically in terms of its positive commandments. Insofar as we have positive commandments within our religion, we could witness for them in the public square and allow that to be what contribution we could make. I think it would be wrong to force them on people who do not agree, and that would be against the framework we seek to create. But I think if we're going to have any framework that will allow us freedom for each kind of person, each view of life, I would insist that it have both these negative rights and some form of positive rights as well. I think to erect a framework on the basis of negative rights alone simply deprives people of civil justice and the chance for human fulfillment, whether they agree or whether they see God as existing or not.
And what exactly are you talking about? This is what scares me. Could you be a little bit more concrete?
Well, gentlemen, I think you've done a really excellent job laying the abstract groundwork for this, and perhaps it would be worthwhile at this time, since I think it's all set up to do it, is to cast it in a contemporary situation that does make it concrete. Would you, for example, Rabbi Ben Ezra, advocate that, or should we not allow to exist white supremacist, neo-Nazi type groups, for example, here in North Idaho?
Anti-Semitic groups. That is interesting. I would answer that not absolutely, from my point of view, but most probably yes. But I see the question of human rights as a balance between the rights of the individual, which you and your country have developed most notably, and I admire all those individual rights that you have discovered. But I think there are another section or kind of rights that the community has in relationship to individual behavior, and I would seek some kind of balance in each individual case between the individual rights or personal rights and the rights of the community. I think in this situation, of course, these groups could exist. But I'm aware of another country in Europe where my people suffered greatly in the 1940s. And in that country now, a certain party called the Nazi Party is banned. I think that is entirely appropriate in the sense that certain institutions can become unlawful given their nature. And given the experience in Germany with the Nazi Party, I think that's an appropriate response. You probably wouldn't agree with me. It probably is against a person's right to assemble and their right to free speech. But I think those rights, balanced off against our communal history, would allow for that kind of activity and that kind of decision.
Justice Douglas.
I think history teaches us that if we're serious about preserving a free and an open and a just society, we have to place freedom of expression in a preferred position from the standpoint of the legal framework in which we operate. In our country, of course, it's the First Amendment that has that preferred position. It doesn't mean necessarily that I read the First Amendment and freedom of expression in an absolute sense. I mean, the actual words of the First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of expression. If you read that absolutely, then obviously no statute, no city ordinance, no law of any kind probably could be promulgated that might restrict speech, and I'm not saying that. But I am saying that given the preferred position of the First Amendment, that you have to make a very, very, very compelling and strong case before you assert the right of the government to limit or suppress speech. And the example that's given here is certainly not that kind of case. Whether or not you like what the other party is saying, in this case, I guess, the Aryan nations, you nonetheless have to understand that your own right to believe and speak and assemble is based on and intimately connected to that other party's right to speak and assemble. And to the extent that you allow the government to express the dominant thinking of society that so-and-so's opinion is not good or is contrary or unpopular, then that same kind of analysis could someday come back and condemn you in terms of your own beliefs and your own right to speak and your own right to assemble. So my argument simply is that we cannot be examining the desirability, the worth, or content of particular opinions or expressions. We have to tolerate them no matter how undesirable they might be in order to preserve our own right to do the same.
I understand what you're saying, and we have suffered from that very thing, and we have inflicted suffering on that very same basis, and I regret that, and that's not part of wisdom. The only distinction I would make here, though, is that in the situation I've adverted to, they still can have their racist beliefs, and they can maybe found other organizations. It's just that this one institution, which has so poisoned and burdened the history of this particular people, is disallowed. So I'm making a distinction between individuals who still have the right to express their opinions and still have a right to assemble, but I am not extending that right to this particular historical organization.
No, but the problem, of course, with that approach is that there are those in history who have said the Jews have poisoned society and ought to be suppressed and denied rights. There are those in history who have said the Christians ought to be persecuted and killed and repressed. There are those who have said that the environmentalists or the non-environmentalists or the socialists or the capitalists. So again, I get back to the point that you have to be very, very careful before you can identify or agree upon a particular harm or danger that is so bad and so injurious to society that it ought to be suppressed. And I can't, as a jurist, think of one except possibly in situations involving national security and warfare, or possibly situations involving the so-called fighting words where someone is not so much trying to express an opinion, which he or she has a right to do, but someone is trying to foment immediate violent reaction and violent behavior and violent unrest. But as we look at those kinds of injuries, those kinds of dangers, I'm not talking about dangers that simply annoy people or cause people inconvenience or discomfort or unrest. I'm talking about serious dangers of an imminent type that we can all agree on. And allowing the Aryan Nation to march through downtown Coeur d'Alene is not that kind of danger. Obviously, if the Aryan Nations marched down Main Street with guns and started shooting them, then we're talking about something else.
Before we get into downtown Coeur d'Alene, I've been wondering about the idea of imminent danger. We already have certain forms of prescribed or prohibited speech. For example, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater precisely because you'll create a panic and people will get hurt. But if I understand Rabbi Ben Ezra correctly, if we have a situation where we have a group of people like the neo-Nazi party who advocate the agenda, essentially, of Adolf Hitler, and then begin to advocate that and advocate that people, in effect, take some sort of stance or some sorts of actions that persecute people, even though the harm isn't immediate. Obviously, it can be tremendous if we look at the slow progression of this in Nazi Germany. It wasn't a few people being crushed in a crowded movie theater. It was millions of people that may eventually suffer from the perpetuation of this kind of speech. So are you sure that there wouldn't be some grounds for prohibiting speech that, though not immediately engendering violent behavior against other people, but might have the more gradual, long-term, and even more serious impact be justified?
Yeah, I would certainly say that what you describe is possible and plausible. But the problem is that it's not an imminent, immediate, compelling problem that can be demonstrated to me with a certain level of certainty. It may be a problem in the long term, as you described. It may not be. But because of the preferred position of free expression and those kinds of values, you haven't made your case. You can try to make the case, but without the elements of imminence and substantial danger that can be demonstrated and proved, then I don't think the preferred position of the First Amendment should be displaced.
I have to almost agree. In the sense that, once again, going back to my analysis, if they, as an institution, for all their hate speech, have not yet done anything against what I consider to be the second law, if they have not yet murdered people, then there is not a situation, as you call, of imminent danger. Although, certainly, we have to admit this kind of behavior and this kind of speech is injurious to us all. We, out of our own religious tradition, know this. We know we shouldn't do it. We know no people should do it. But until we have at least some initial action that goes against our law, then we cannot respond to what they're doing, although we certainly
If I can add something, I mean, it's not so much that we have to accept or embrace or adopt the beliefs that we think are destructive and unhealthy to a free society. We can certainly find antidotes to counter that speech, but we can't do it through government suppression of that speech. I mean, the antidote to bad speech is good speech. You know, the response to the Aryan nations is to tell the Aryan nations and to educate society about the Aryan nations and why they're wrong. So certainly speech can be countered by speech, the more the better in my view, but it shouldn't be countered by government restriction.
Well, let's take up the question about the prospective parade by the Aryan nations in downtown Coeur d'Alene. It was originally aimed at Hitler's birthday, and for various reasons, apparently that's not going to happen. And they may or may not actually be able to express their points of view in this way, but they presumably will try again. What are your beliefs about groups with an agenda like this making fairly large-scale displays which attract a lot of media attention and thereby, in effect, disseminate their doctrine well beyond the parade grounds, and again, though not imminent, perhaps inciting grave danger for large numbers of people all over the place later on?
I am in Alexandria no stranger to such activity, and I am no stranger at all to the long-term danger generated by such activity. But once again, because in a sense, because of our balance of power, everyone is able to do these activities to a certain point. Until the long-term danger becomes short-term, until the long-term danger translates itself into some kind of immediate action, we basically have to endure each other. And I find it painful, and I find what they say to be evil, but I'm in a state of endurance, okay, in our situation.
Yes, and I think we always have to walk in the other person's shoes and visualize ourselves in situations which you don't ordinarily take for granted. I mean, all of us think about free speech and take it for granted because the majority of us are white and many of us are privileged, and therefore free speech is something that's just part of the environment that we live in. African Americans in this country were able to get a foothold of constitutional protection through the right of free expression and the right of assembly. Unionists in this country were able to work for better and safer and more healthy working conditions because of the right of speech and the right of assembly. To deny certain groups those rights takes away from certain groups the power to change society. And change sometimes requires us to produce a certain amount of unrest and annoyance in the audience which we want to change. Will I be changed if the Aryan Nations walks down Main Street in Coeur d'Alene? No. Does Richard Butler have a right, an opportunity to try to change my opinion so that I would become a bigot? Let him. I'm not going to listen. I'm not going to be there. I'm not going to watch the TV news on it. I hope no one else does. And that's my response.
Well, let's shift from streets to highways here. In this case, the information highway, or the internet, where apparently more and more of this kind of racist dialogue is taking place in chat groups and so on and so forth on the internet. Do you believe, I think I'll start with you this time, Justice Douglas, do you believe that this very new and almost totally unregulated medium should have some sort of policy or constraints or regulations on the kinds of things that are discussed and advocated there? For example, do we disseminate instructions to make bombs, for example, so that people that are persuaded by this doctrine can then go carry out things against other people? What do you think?
My response is that the values, the principles, the analysis is no different. The internet is simply another form, another way to communicate information. And information, philosophy, ideas, beliefs are what expression is made of, no matter how it's communicated. My sense is the more information, the more speech, the better. So I don't think the analysis is different, which again is not to say it can't be restricted, but it can only be restricted when the preferred position supporting free expression is overcome by some very imminent great evil of a substantive nature that goes beyond just mere unrest or annoyance or unpopular belief.
I guess I'm a general thinker. I know nothing of the internet, of course. In Alexandria, we have no internet. We have no electricity. But in that sense, still, it sounds like the internet is a forum for free speech. And I understand that it's fairly new, and it's running ahead of its regulation. Certainly, regulation will catch up with it to some degree at some point. But through all of this, and hearing all that you say about the preferred position, I keep coming back to this basic kind of philosophical approach I have to human rights in general and human community in particular. And as I hear you talk and understand this preferred position, I guess what I cannot share fully is the preferredness or the preference for this position. I like this position. I'm in favor of it. It's always in that sense right. But I somehow, in my general thought, clearly see it as a matter of balance in that sense. I realize the dangers involved, especially the dangers involved with cultural dominance. When one large group with its view of the world decides, what other people should believe or do, that is the great danger that we face. And the preferred position is created precisely to protect minorities and protect people in those situations, people who annoy other people. It's a great exercise in freedom, but if I could just echo one thing I've heard even here just yesterday, it is something that my people have understood from the beginning. From the beginning and from our prophets, we've always understood a notion of social justice to be essential to human community. And it includes freedom, but in a sense it also includes responsibility. And I guess my problem is that I basically see freedom and responsibility as the two poles in the situation that need to be balanced off one against another. And I give responsibility sometimes a preferred position. And that is probably the basis for the generation of our differences. One of my own people, a man by the name of Viktor Frankl, who just died a couple of years ago and survived a concentration camp known as Auschwitz, always said about the United States that in addition to the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor, you need another statue in San Francisco Bay. You need the Statue of Responsibility. And his notion was that if you have freedom on one side of your country and responsibility on the other, then a certain maturity will occur. And until responsibility is as important as freedom, that maturity tends to, in a certain extent, elude us. And so this is my basic approach to the situation. This is probably why I cannot be so formally supportive and so unrestrictively supportive of the preferred position. I realize the dangers, but that is just my background, and that's kind of my basic situation.
I'm thinking a couple of different things in listening to both of you. Your position about the necessity for imminent danger of violence being the criteria or grounds by which, and the only grounds by which we could suspend free speech is rattling around on one side of my brain. And Rabbi Ben Ezra, if I may say, you perhaps are being a little too politically correct here. It seems as though the reason that you wrote your book, Wisdom, was in effect to prevent defection of your people to the Greek gods. And if I'm not mistaken, there were numerous instances in Tanakh and Torah when people who were advocating the preference for gods other than Yahweh were promptly silenced by being killed. Are you sure you don't want to press the point a bit about the slower but perhaps even more dangerous and insidious creeping kind of violence as being an equal justification, if that can be demonstrated somehow as a strong likelihood? In either case, you're predicting the future as some sort of imminent violence.
I am aware of this. I certainly, yes, believe that, and I'm aware of it. I'm just aware that basically what I want us to do is approach this creeping violence on the basis of what wisdom requires us to do, and that would be my basic understanding. I have trouble locating and understanding the immediate effect of this creeping violence that you're talking about. I'm aware of it. I'm aware we practiced it. I'm aware that other people have practiced it upon us. It's just hard to deal with on a regular basis, except that we pay attention to wisdom and respond to what it requires of us.
It strikes me as I listen to the rabbi here that this is a much more benign, sort of innocent, smoother, scholarly image than the image I get of the arguably very harsh Jewish God and his commandments and the punishments for violating those commandments in the books of the Old Testament. My fear isn't the fear of the image that you project. My fear is that in reality there will be punishment, and if that philosophy should reign in a particular government, that punishment will be swift, and it'll be rigorous, and it'll be unforgiving to those of us who might disagree. And of course that is behind everything that I've argued already, and we know about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the reasons I wrote the Book of Wisdom, besides curtailing defection or forestalling defection, was also to basically talk over the heads of my brethren and talk to the rest of my city, to talk to the secular world, and let them take up this cause on their own basis. And on that basis, I was hoping that we could grow together and create some kind of common standard or common situation. So I have two possibilities there. Secondly, by watching our own books and reading our own books, and by the scholarship on our own books over time, one realizes that our concept of God has matured as well. And the challenge is to live life on the basis of this more mature concept of God. And by no means is it guaranteed, and by all means do we need some kind of basic framework around societies and the interactions of men to keep us from lapsing back into our more primitive notions.
But the theory that's put forth in the question here, I think, is there is a danger that's sort of a creeping, evolutionary, slowly developing danger, and you need to sort of snip it in the bud before it overwhelms you, like Nazism in Germany. You know, as a justice, the one decision that I'm most regretful and ashamed of is my concurrence in the Supreme Court opinion that allowed Japanese Americans to be incarcerated in concentration camps during the Second World War. The argument made at that time by the government was that there is this creeping danger, this potential injury, and we need to nip it in the bud now so it doesn't develop into some real problem for us as we fight the Asians and the Germans in the Second World War. I'm ashamed of that, and I think most people in the 1970s or 1980s today feel the same way. That was a serious mistake. And it's because we forgot the framework and we forgot the assumptions and the values of which we're speaking today.
Let's perhaps broaden this discussion out to other forms of speech and conduct, in this case with regard to sexual behavior and speech about that sort of a thing. To what degree should we, for example, restrict pornography? And before you begin, you might want to take a stab at defining pornography and obscenity.
I defer to the Justice William O. Douglas. Obscenity, that's mostly religious for me, and I need a better definition. And he's the one who can distinguish between, I hope, between pornography and obscenity.
But certainly someone who has a quiet and simple mind, through wisdom, can discern what obscenity is and how it might be distinguished from pornography. You still wish to defer? Okay. Legally speaking, at least in terms of American jurisprudence, over the years, obscenity has not been protected because it's deemed simply not to have any valuable content to it. Nothing of value socially, literarily, artistically, scientifically, etc. I think most jurists have always agreed that obscenity is outside the protection of the First Amendment. The problem, of course, is what is obscenity, how to define it. And that requires sort of splitting the tomato very thinly in terms of drawing lines between what is and what is not arguably obscene. It's an impossible struggle. No one has ever solved the problem. My solution is that we ought to simply stay away from it except to the extent that we can protect children and regulate obscenity in terms of time, place, and manner, but not outlawing it altogether. Otherwise, you get into questions that arguably are questions of personal conscience. It implicates questions of personal freedom, and I think also questions of religion, all of which I think are protected in the First Amendment. We ought to stay away from the issue except for regulating it in time, place, and manner, and safeguarding kids.
Isn't time, place, and manner a restriction on free expression?
Yes.
And this is admissible in our system and within our framework?
Yeah, time, place, and manner doesn't mean that Aryan nations can walk down the middle of the street without a permit in the middle of the night blowing bugles. Mm-hmm. It means that they can be regulated in terms of certain times, places, and the manner in which they express themselves, but they can't be denied the opportunity altogether. I didn't really define obscenity. There is a definition. Is the matter primarily prurient, and is it without serious social, artistic, literary, scientific value? And that's to be judged by community standards.
And violate local community standards
as well. Yes, local community standards. And so, what's obscene to you may not be obscene to me. Ultimately, I guess juries get together and decide whether or not, an image of a penis or a vagina in one setting is obscene, whereas maybe it's not obscene in another setting. And it's, in my view, a very bizarre and impossible endeavor.
I don't know. This is to some degree beyond my experience, and not completely, though, beyond my experience. I must mention, I think we can talk about this, my experience in Alexandria. The Greeks are a free people, and they engage in many, many forms of activity. And 200 years ago, before my great-grandparents were alive, the Greeks had a parade, a victory parade. Their leader, Ptolemy, had gone on a conquering expedition. And he had conquered, I remember who, probably his brothers in Babylon, extended his domain to some degree. And he brought back many, many captives, and it was the common practice to have a parade of captives. But we were used to this, and this is not by any means pornographic or obscene. We would attend the parades ourselves. He decided, though, that he wanted more than just a victory parade. So in addition to the captives, he would have a celebration of Greek culture, whatever that meant, and whoever wanted to, enter into this celebration. And he had women dressed up as various Greek cities. And he had what you would call floats. He had large carts, flat carts on wheels drawn by slaves. And they would put various things representing various Greek cities and so on and so forth in a big long line. So in the midst of all these captives, there were also floats representing Greek achievement. We were sitting there watching the parade, but then right in the middle of it, or toward the end of it, down the street came a large float, a large flat cart-like object, and many slaves are pulling it on ropes. And it contained, mounted on it was a 21-foot model of a phallus covered with gold, sprinkled with jewels, and with a big star around it. And this was considered part of the parade, and we found this offensive. So I think this is the point, precisely where you come into local community standards. You try to realize some kind of what you'd call slicing of the tomato. And I think this was a situation where we tried to not have that appear. But it appeared. Okay, it was not our prerogative to decide whether.
And again, I think this is a situation where you need to walk in the other person's shoes if you haven't already done so. I mean, imagine being an artist, say an author, who gives his life, his soul, over to creating a book like The Virgin and the Gypsy by D.H. Lawrence and other books, and then having a ban and having the government say people can't read it because it's obscene. It's a very strange notion.
Let me pose a question that represents a bit of a Talmudic exercise, Rabbi Ben Ezra. As I recall, Yahweh, the Lord God, was doing some censorship on the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, which of course was relegated, or not relegated, but devoted to particular kinds of overt conduct and not speech like we're talking about with pornography. But the Talmudic exercise would then be to try to interpret that in light of pornography. They didn't have the means for pornography in those days. How would we interpret Jewish tradition on speech and other kinds of depictions of that behavior which the Lord God found so offensive, and which speech could contribute to that behavior which he found so offensive?
The thing to realize is that for us, and maybe this is just for us, the notion of pornography or fornication is tied in with the worship of our God. And the two issues stem from a common source. And the greater way of understanding this relationship is to understand it religiously in terms of our relationship with our God. And yet, this kind of behavior is not that far separate from repudiating the worship of our God. So it's a central issue for us. It's not a matter of self-expression in that sense, although it clearly is a matter of self-expression. But it goes much more centrally and deeply into the situation. And our understanding of God is primarily then what you would call nuptial or faithful. It has a relationship quality about it. And when that relationship is violated, then that's at the very heart of our understanding of God and reality. Sodom and Gomorrah, we would probably see, by their overt conduct, we would probably assume that their relationship with God was probably a mirror of their overt conduct in that sense. And that's initiating or explaining God's response to these places. That would be the basic way of understanding it. But the two issues are very close and very much one for us.
And then how does that translate in terms of your understanding of modern society and the right or wrongness of regulating fornication or expressions of fornication?
Modern society does not share this joining of these two issues. And so they will go about it. The Greeks, even in Alexandria, do not understand the one issue to be related to the other. And so we have to adjust. We have to understand it. If you want to be put in another person's shoes, the hardest moment for us to be put in anyone else's shoes is to understand somebody doing this without the God relationship being part of the situation. That is our biggest reach imaginatively.
In order to allow some time for some questions, perhaps we ought to kind of return full circle to where we started, that you may sort of wrap up or summarize the different points of view here. How can a free society maintain human rights in the face of cultural dominance? or in the face of changing cultural dominance, which seems to be the situation right now. Again, how can a free society maintain human rights in the face of one culture clearly dominating another and in processes of change when this is happening? Justice Douglas.
Well, as I said, I think the chief thing that distinguishes a free society where individuals are honored and respected in terms of their autonomy and their potential for growth, that distinguishes that society from a totalitarian society is free speech, free assembly, and freedom of conscience. Without that, we run the fear of living in a totalitarian system, whether it's a theocracy, a dictatorship, a communist system, or what have you. This is the indispensable ingredient, to my way of thinking, of freedom.
I would say, yes, this is not an experience that I've had, but we have never been culturally dominant, except in Jerusalem, and our behavior there has been difficult as well. I think for us, cultural dominance would be seen primarily as a temptation. And that primarily would be something that we would have to pay strict attention to in terms of transgressing on other people when we are the dominant culture. So much becomes so easy to assume when everyone else thinks the way you do, when you are the dominant culture. And so what we need is a very, very strict adherence and a strict awareness of other cultures, and especially of the wisdom behind our own culture, to understand where God may be found and to understand where God may be leading us. That is my rabbi's response to the situation. I would see cultural dominance primarily as a temptation we should be aware of and consistently, in that sense, refuse to do anything against what I call the silver law, or the second tablet of the law, on the basis of cultural dominance. If we're doing that, we're in trouble.
Thank you very much. I hope that this very interesting conversation on an important issue has generated some questions in your minds. We still have, I think, some time for this. I believe the microphone is on, and since we're recording this conversation, it's so that everyone can hear your question. If you do have a question, would you please come to the microphone and ask it?
The question is primarily for the justice here, but you may answer, Rabbi, if you wish. You mentioned in the debate, as far as protecting children, that some restrictions as to time, place, and manner of obscenity might be appropriate. Where do you draw the line between what a child is and an adult is? The arbitrary distinction of age 18 seems to be a bit harsh in things, and some 15-year-olds are as mature, more mentally capable than 25-year-olds, and different things like that. And how do children's rights play into the development of a framework for a free society?
I think that's a very interesting question and an important question, and I'm not sure I can answer it. I mean, the easy answer is that there does seem to be a consensus that children are especially vulnerable, and that the government, in loco parentis, standing in the place of parents, has some responsibility to safeguard children from known dangers, including censoring or making obscenity and perhaps pornography unavailable to them. I think the position legally is not only should children be protected in terms of limiting time, place, and manner, but they should be absolutely protected from any kind of exposure to obscenity, whatever obscenity is. The other part of the question, though, is the hard part. I mean, at what point are kids mature enough where they can understand and process that information in a way that will be fruitful for them rather than unhealthy and destructive to them? We arbitrarily, of course, in most states decide that age is 18 simply because it's difficult to put each individual to the test of his or her maturity. I mean, there's no way the government can kind of test everyone in terms of whether they're mature enough at age 14 or 16 or 19. So we have that arbitrary sort of cutoff age, and I think for reasons of convenience, we're stuck with an arbitrary age where people are deemed to be minors and without certain privileges, after which they do have those privileges, and I think that's simply a issue of convenience and practicality as opposed to anything more profound or anything richer than that in terms of legal doctrine. So my answer is, yes, I think kids probably should be protected because of their special place in the government's relation to them. Whether 18 is the right age, I can't answer. It probably is, only because that seems to be the consensus that's been worked out by the 50 states over many years.
My answer is kind of goes in two directions. In Alexandria, at my time and amongst my people, we marry much earlier than 18. So to a certain extent, there's experience for 15, 16-year-old people. On the other hand, with regards to wisdom, it usually doesn't happen until they're far past 18. So I'm just caught between both parts here of the situation.
You both acknowledge that behavior can be a form of free speech. I think we all understand that the flag is something special. Philosophically, Rabbi, should we have a statute in place to prevent desecration to the flag? And Mr. Justice, can a constitutional one be crafted?
Not fight over it. Could we come up with a constitutional amendment against flag desecration? Was that it?
It need not be amendment. Should there be some law to prevent desecration of the flag?
Should there be a law to... this is hard for me to answer. Clearly, I would have laws against desecration of religious objects, and that would be a simple practice in my community. With the flag, we have an object here which is not, strictly speaking, religious. And so I'm in a kind of gray zone. I don't know to what degree people consider it sacred or whatever. As symbolic of the nation, I think maybe there would be a situation where flag desecration would be a very important symbolic act in regards to free speech for you. That is not, though, something that I could give a definitive opinion on. I would guess that the Americans would not want to do that. I would guess that I would probably want to do that. I don't know which way it would go.
Yeah, of course, there's a political component here as well as a legal one. And the two do intersect. I think Justice Scalia in today's world would give a different answer than I would as Justice Douglas. But I think it's important, speaking as Justice Douglas, that we understand that, in my view, the essence, reduced to its essence, the flag represents the First Amendment. The flag represents free expression as a symbol. And to punish someone for exercising free expression because they burnt the flag would be both very hypocritical and very contradictory in terms of the exercise of government power. I can't imagine, given how I understand and interpret the First Amendment, that any constitutional flag, that it would be possible to pass a constitutional flag desecration statute.
And what would Justice Scalia say?
Justice Scalia would say, well, if you pass a statute such as ones that were recently found unconstitutional, that is directed at speech having to do with the flag as a symbol, it's probably unconstitutional. But if you pass a law that says no flags, whatever their type, or other materials can be burned, creating smoke, then probably you could encompass flag desecration as just a nuisance in terms of, a nuisance statute, an anti-burning statute. So it has to do with whether the government's trying to get at flag burning because it's a form of political expression versus including flag burning in burning statutes, if you understand what I'm saying.
Well, let's see, I have one. There's a bit of a pause here. This is a situation where the value of free speech and the value of privacy seem to be both equally protected, presumably under the Constitution, seem to be in conflict. And I'm thinking about the media's right to free speech, and in the exercising of that right, they in effect intrude on the privacy of people like President Clinton, or Princess Diana, or all of these Hollywood celebrities, and so on and so forth. Are there no limits to free speech? Does it outweigh everything? Even though they're public figures, they still have human private lives. For the sake of finding things that they can freely speak, is that something that isn't subject to any kind of constraint, even in the face of what is presumably an equal value, which is privacy? Caught you off guard, both of you, probably with that one.
We have to think.
Well, I'll take a shot at it. I mean, of course, the First Amendment covers freedom of the press. Some people argue that it implies also the public's right to know, even though it obviously doesn't say anything in those terms or by those words. The Constitution also, and as Justice Douglas, I authored the opinion in Griswold versus Connecticut, has identified a right of privacy, which you refer to, even though that word doesn't appear in the Constitution either, or at least in the Bill of Rights. I think that once an individual injects himself or herself into the public domain by running for political office and getting elected, he or she certainly has very diminished privacy. And I think the First Amendment, in terms of freedom of the press, would allow the press to investigate just about anything they wanted. And for the Congress or state legislators to legislate to the contrary could create some very serious constitutional questions.
What about public figures who are not running for private office, movie stars?
I think, again, from a constitutional standpoint, that to the extent that you voluntarily injected yourself or made yourself available for public scrutiny by the circumstances or situation you've put yourself into, which would include movie stars, I think that to that same extent, probably the public has a right to scrutinize your life and what you're doing. Now, that doesn't mean that people can do anything they want. I mean, we still have laws against defamation, libel, and slander. It's just a little bit more difficult to stick someone like a newspaper or magazine with libel and slander when you're dealing with a public figure, as opposed to a citizen who has tried to keep his or her life purely private.
In my experience and in my community, there is no final division or separation between the private life and the public life. So we haven't separated them and defined them and tried to figure out which goes where. And it's just, yeah, in that sense, it's a tradition foreign to my experience.
Well, let's get philosophic about it a minute. Instead of purely thinking in legal terms, I'm interested to know why the public has the right to know about the president's private sins, let's say.
But I think it's a political question. I mean,
no, but if you say that in the Constitution the presumption is that the public has a right to know about things that I would presume impact the performance of the government and its elected officials and so forth. But why, if there isn't any relevance to acts of private conduct, why does the public have the right to know about that stuff other than almost a kind of prurient interest that has no redeeming social value?
I would argue that Professor Jenkinson this morning would take the position that whether or not an elected leader or an appointed leader is virtuous is important for us to know. And virtue has to do with whether or not you're consistent in what you say and how you live your life, including matters of sexuality and other issues that touch on our moral sensibilities. So I guess the argument could be that we deserve to know whether or not our president is moral and virtuous, especially if he pretends to be moral and virtuous and perhaps, in fact, is not. That would be the argument. I don't necessarily buy it. And you can perhaps just, explain why I don't buy it.
You are a mystery to me. No, basically, yeah, in our sense, not having separated public from private life, then this is something where anything can come up at any point, either what you would consider public or private. And so in a sense, yes, that could be, especially in a king, to do things that are against God's law or in our situation would be a disastrous business because it would have theological, divine repercussions on the entire community. So we judged it rather quickly. When kings are bad and they ignore God, we all suffer for it. And that's part of our experience and part of our writing. So we deal with it in a much more immediate sense. And we lack the middle ground that you seem to enjoy. It just is part of our situation.
Well, David was read out rather badly by one of the prophets for his affair with Bathsheba, but he wasn't impeached for it.
It made him a better king.
Well, but in fact, in the books of the Old Testament, I mean, geez, people are sleeping around all the time. You know, daughters are sleeping with uncles, and, you know, people are getting drunk and waking up with someone who's not their wife, and they sort of get away with it. And at other times, it seems to me, we're getting somewhat far afield of your question, but at other times it seems to me, you know, God, you know, punishes, even kills people for doing something that in the next book they do and they're sort of commended for. I don't get it. Could you explain that to me?
If the Bible has one author, and it does, it works through many different people writing different books and at different times, and that's what shows, I think, in much too large degree in what you're talking about. I just feel that basically there is an immediacy about the situation that we experience as a culture and as a group, and that is the basis for our experience of the private and the public and the relationship between them. And there's, you know, the concept of God has evolved, and we're just trying to deal with the best concept that we have. So that's basically the situation.
Well, let's feed this back out to the audience. Have any other questions come up since you've been listening to what's been said? That's Taylor.
I have a question actually about the dominance in society. I would argue that American society has been colored by dominant schools of thought that have changed, like with the 14th Amendment when it was used to protect big businesses rather than like black Americans. Do you feel or agree with me that there are still dominances that color our actions?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I think that's the importance of everything that I've been arguing today. It's because people tend to congregate into groups for the purpose of dominating, say, the political decision-making or other areas of society, that we have to be very careful to give a preferred position to the values of the First Amendment. All of us feel that we're right, you know, to the point of many of us being, you know, real radical in our assessment of our rightness and our wrongness, as opposed to people who feel in a contrary way. We want to control the agenda politically and socially and culturally. And it's because of the human nature to come together in an effort to dominate that we have to be very, very careful. Now, even the Constitution can be perverted if you get a dominant philosophy controlling the interpretation of the Constitution. Fortunately, I think our history shows that the constitutional interpretation has varied over time in a way that has been, for the most part, very progressive and very wise. But to answer your question, yes, dominant parts of our culture have come to control certain decisions at certain times, and they have used the law and constitutional interpretation to that end.
Right, but the First Amendment has not always had a preferred place either. It's been warped and twisted as much as anything else.
There's some question as to whether it has a preferred place today with today's court. You're absolutely right.
But would you say that it's more important to base that preference on like a majority rule, because the way of our political system is set up, we basically pay attention to the majority, they elect our officials and everything like that?
No, absolutely not. I mean, the whole problem with First Amendment and the Bill of Rights in general, including the 14th Amendment, is that it runs counter to the majoritarian nature and thrust of our Constitution. The Bill of Rights, including the 14th Amendment, is anti-majoritarian. It's anti-democratic. It basically is the proposition that we, as a democratic society, do not get to vote on certain questions. You don't get to vote on denying African Americans' rights. You don't get to vote on denying certain elements of society.
But when we as a majority elect people that have an exceedingly dominant school of thought, where most of the country agrees with them, they are allowed to, you know, send Japanese Americans to concentration camps, which is against
if the Supreme Court allows that in terms of its constitutional interpretation, that's true.
Right. So doesn't that place the First Amendment underneath majority rule at times, and at times not?
Yes, it does. Again, I think it has to do with the philosophy, the integrity, the wisdom of the judiciary that is charged with the responsibility of interpreting and understanding the Constitution. I've suggested today what my belief as Justice Douglas is with regard to those issues. A Justice Scalia, a Justice Rehnquist sitting here would perhaps give you a different sense of how the balance should be struck, to use the balancing test that was suggested by the rabbi here. My preferred position argument is not necessarily well accepted or popular today.
One thing, too, William O. Douglas and I have talked about this before we first appeared here, and one of the things we realized in this country right now, we're facing a certain kind of crisis of dominance, in the sense that the group that ethnically or historically founded this country and has maintained the majority position in the country and has set the agenda is becoming smaller. And other kinds of groups are coming up and beginning to engage in more dominance, more attempts to set the agenda. On that basis, then, we are in a kind of nether zone, trying to decide how we're going to go in the future, and it is not clear. So this is a time when our faith in the Bill of Rights will be rather well tested.
Let me just end with one quick anecdote. This actually has to do more with freedom of religion in the First Amendment rather than freedom of speech, but it's the same sort of values at work. I was contacted, I'm out of role now, I was contacted actually here in Spokane County some years ago by a group of witches. They constituted a coven. They were good witches, they weren't bad witches.
Never use your powers for evil.
They celebrated some of the pagan beliefs and traditions of the pre-Christian times, maybe including those that were going on in Alexandria. They wanted to have someone representing their group speak at a high school graduation. And I thought, how interesting. Finally, I have a vehicle to educate certain elements of the Christian community as to why we shouldn't allow certain kinds of prayer or religious celebrations in schools. And everyone I talked to among those elements of the Christian community understood immediately that we should not allow the pagan coven of witches to celebrate their religion at a high school ceremony.
I'd like to bounce off of that for just maybe it may end up being the final thing. The American Indians have had somewhat inconsistent experience with our application of the principles that we're discussing here. For a long period of time, there was an attempt to assimilate them into our culture. And they, for example, were forced to cut their hair, but their hair was an expression, an important expression of their manhood, their sense of warriorship, and their personal identity. And as if that wasn't bad enough, they were not allowed to speak their own language without severe retribution within the school systems that they were forced to attend. They'd have to sometimes go dozens or even hundreds of miles to boarding schools and so forth, where they were beaten. Had their hair cut, and they were beaten if they spoke their native language. How is it that we somehow or other find exceptions for certain groups of people, thinking in terms of the dominant culture motif, which we would, reject if it was the Aryan nations, but somehow or other it's okay if it's Indians? This doesn't seem to square too well with my mind. I don't catch this drift, so to speak.
Well, that for me would be the crux of the matter in one example of what I call the temptation to cultural dominance. And part of that situation would be picking and choosing which groups you like and you're going to, which groups you don't, and behaving differently toward different groups. That's the essence of the temptation right there.
And I think it's also a function of the numbers in society. I mean, Native Americans are a very small minority in this society, and this country, in my view, has treated them horrendously and wrongly and in an unconstitutional fashion throughout their history. And we continue to do so, partly because it's a part of society that's relatively hidden from mainstream dominant society.
Well, I think we might have time for one more, but it looks like we're otherwise getting to the end of our time here before the response panel discussion to follow. Is there one more question from the audience, though?
There's one there.
Yes, please.
We discussed governments and their role in censorship and freedom of expression and things, but as we move into the 21st century, multinational corporations and private how has a very large impact on society and a control over it. How how does the First Amendment apply to protecting freedom of expression, say, in the workplace or in the media that may be owned privately? Or how does it apply to private industry as well to government, or does it at all?
Boy, that's a very complex and a very
It's an
good
excellent question.
And I sure can't begin
Great
to
one to
answer
end
it,
on.
both because I don't have the information. That's certainly not within my area of expertise or study. I can tell you, though, the whole area of commercial speech, speech generated by businesses, companies, corporations, is evaluated by a different standard than private speech, particularly private speech of a political or a religious nature. So corporations in some ways do not have the same rights that private flesh and blood individuals have under First Amendment analysis. And the other thing is, to the extent corporations have a public role that's analogous to, say, a public agency or a public organization run, controlled by the government, then they may have the same, they may be restricted in terms of, the same ways that government is limited and restricted. So that's sort of a short answer.
Just to add to that, I'm out of character in that sense. Yeah, just read an article 2 or 3 months ago in The Atlantic, which basically has your thesis. And the thesis is basically that corporations, having become so strong and so powerful and so multinational, have become incipient forms of new political organization. And so people will live in the corporate culture and they'll live in the culture of their country. And in that sense, that's a prime test of our Constitution and our Bill of Rights, because people in that sense will have willy-nilly built into them, to a certain extent, 2 sets of loyalties.
Well,
and so that's
one
part
of the places that's
challenge.
been explored and currently is being explored is in trying to reform the giving money to politicians. What am I trying to say? All the laws controlling financing campaigns, and corporations tend to be treated differently, and there are some First Amendment issues there.
Well,
Before you close the comment, one announcement.
yeah.
We have a 15-minute break before we have another group of historical people on the panel, but there is a snack bar upstairs if anyone is thirsty and so forth. It's just upstairs here if they would like to. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Well, this has been a very stimulating and interesting
Thank you.
conversation. I've certainly enjoyed it. I want to thank our splendid guests, Rabbi Simeon Ben Ezra and the esteemed Justice William O. Douglas, and George Critchlow and Pat Lippert, respectively, who played these people. Thank you very much, all of you, for being here.
All right.